What's the best way for a state to select its judges? It's a question North Carolina lawmakers have been wrestling with in recent months. The John Locke Foundation partnered with the Center for the Study of Free Enterprise at Western Carolina University to host a panel discussion on the topic. Carolina Journal Radio has invited the panelists to share their ideas. In this segment, we welcome Bryan McCannon, Assistant Professor of Economics at West Virginia University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So there are a lot of different ways you could go about selecting judges. You could have elections, partisan or nonpartisan. You could have an appointment by the governor or by the General Assembly. You could have some sort of merit selection system. Do you have a preference, and if so, why?
Yeah, that's a good opening question. When I started preparing my remarks for this event, my first thought was that there's so many dimensions to the problem, the dilemma, if you will, right? So we have the issue in North Carolina is whether or not we go with partisan or nonpartisan judicial elections and this switch. But as you just mentioned, the issue is even broader than just the issue of whether or not you get an R or D next to your name, but should you just completely change to other types of selections other than direct selection? And so it's kind of tough. You got to pick which one of these issues to delve into first. So with regard to the partisan versus nonpartisan of judges, right? This is a really hot issue in the U.S., right? I'm from West Virginia. We just switched to a nonpartisan election system away from partisan. So we're moving the opposite direction, North Carolina, right? So on that issue of partisan versus nonpartisan, right? I think of it as an economist coming at these problems, right? That we're at the most proximate, the most immediate is information to voters, right? So we're literally talking about whether this D or R shows up on the ballot. And so in general, my default position is more information tends to beat less information in all situations, right? Unless someone can convince me of a strong negative spillover effect that this would have, right? You really got to say, like, there's such a negative externality that we have to control and regulate this kind of information. So that's how I think about the partisanship question. I think it does. I think there's plenty of research that shows that partisanship does have informational value to voters, right? It serves as this cue. It tells us something. Now, we can debate over whether that's good information, whether we agree with the people and what they're doing with information, and we can ask what kind of information it's providing, right? But from what research seems to show is from voters' perspective, this is an important bit of information, right? And so it's tough for an economist to actually have an opinion because we're always, on the other hand, kind of people, right?
Like Harry Truman and his one-handed economist
is ideal, right? But voters are free to ignore this information, right? If it is valuable to them and available, I can understand why having partisanship is would be something we would like to see on the ballot still. Right, but one wonders if we're getting the right type of information, right? By that, but then I also think, what's the opportunity cost? Like, what's the outside option? What if we're just focusing on the most immediate, like voters' information and what they're responding to? If we take away partisanship, what would they be focusing on, right? What are they going to fill in that void? Are they just not going to participate? Right, roll off, as it's called, is it's a big issue. Whether it's a problem or not, it's for debate. People will vote for the high profile. Everyone wants to vote in the presidential election. People want to vote in the governor election. Once you get down the ballot, at some point, people quit, right? And so, do we care about that issue, right? And does having partisan tags lead to less participation, right? I'll tell you, just looking at voting data, what gets more votes cast is having a contest, right? That's way more important, right? People don't vote when there's no contest to vote in, right? But one thing, some of my research on this issue is with regards to looking at the names. If you take away partisanship, so I'm looking like judge elections. When you take away partisanship, people are only left with the name there, and that makes salient other concerns: gender, race, ethnicity, things like this will become very salient if there's nothing else but that in front of them, right? And so in my own research, I've seen that there's big gender differences, for example, in votes. So I was looking at retention elections, and so where actually women get more votes cast, right, by having a female name than men, everything else held constant, right? And that could be preference, that could be unconscious. Who knows, right? But you make those things at the top of the list when you take away partisanship, right? So I think at the proximate thing, that's a really important thing to think about.
That is the voice of Bryan McCannon, assistant professor of economics at West Virginia University. And the things you were just saying reminded me that some of the people we've had running for judicial elections during the time when North Carolina had nonpartisan races were our current Chief Justice is named Mark Martin, like a NASCAR driver. One time, one of the people running against was a Rachel Hunter, who was the same name as a supermodel. And so I imagine when there's no party label, you do see more of that, the people who have sort of famous names running for office.
And one thing, research needs to improve in this and help us understand a little bit more about what voters respond to. Because one would expect, I would ask a question not only about the gender and ethnicity and things like this, but what does this do to incumbency advantage, right? If the current trial court judge is in the local newspaper on a pretty frequent basis, because I like to read the crime section, right, and see what's going on and who's in trial and that kind of stuff, right? But if that's what your local residents are paying attention to, at least the registered voters who are showing up are reading your local papers, and they're seeing the name of your local judge. Now, how does somebody compete against that person if they have less information about them, right? So that my hunch is that incumbency advantage might be even stronger in nonpartisan elections, right?
So North Carolina, for years, had partisan elections, then went away and had nonpartisan elections, has recently restored partisan elections, and is thinking about other potential changes. Do you have the sense that North Carolina would be well served sticking with what it has for a while, or should it be studying all these other issues on an ongoing basis?
Yeah. That's a real tough one. So I'm kind of a fan of the election mechanism, right? So if we think about alternatives, right? Again, I'm an economist, so I'm thinking, well, what's the opportunity? What do we see if we don't have an election mechanism, partisan or non, right? What does that thing look like? There are usually some types of appointment. At least there's not direct selection, right? Whether it's a governor appointing or some committee that puts forth a list of names to the governor. There's a lot of mechanisms out there. So I'm actually reminded of a paper by famous economists 50 years ago, right? It's called "Public Decisions as Public Goods." His name was Gordon Tullock, is a famous guy, and so he talked about this issue. At least his argument comes to my mind, and what he said was, well, what should we think about? Should we think about the incentives? So he talked about judges, and he said that most of the decisions judges make day in and day out, they're very unlikely to be directly affected by those in their private life. If they say something about contract law, what's the chance that they're going to have a contract where that specific ruling will then come back and affect them? Very unlikely. So we're asking judges to provide these things we call public goods, right? And there's an incentive problem there, right? With if you're not directly affected by your rulings, then why put forth good effort, that kind of stuff, right? And so the question is, well, how do we get a good accountability mechanism, right? And so what Tullock argues, right, is, well, from one perspective, you can say, well, voters don't have the incentive to hold these judges accountable, right? They're first of all not very well informed, right? They don't have the incentive to become informed. So it's kind of two-level problem. He says, well, what about the bureaucrat, the regulator, whoever this might be, who's supposed to be doing this for them? Well, they also would be faced with the exact same incentive problems. If I was in the governor's office, some Wake County trial court judge, am I going to be spending a lot of my office's resources, time, and effort on evaluating the decisions of that guy? And why would that person have the incentive? Well, maybe there's some voter who's going to hold the governor's office accountable for what Wake County trial court. That's unlikely. So his argument was, when you have multiple layers of this kind of principal agent problem that that appointment system would have, it seems even less likely that some kind of bureaucratic regulation is going to solve when they have this problem, when they have the same incentive problems that voters have of this kind of public good problem. So I like the Tullock argument quite a bit on this one.